You can spend years trying to improve yourself and still feel like you are not enough. No matter what you achieve, there is always someone doing better, moving faster, living more confidently. And even when you know, logically, that comparison is pointless, the feeling does not disappear. It sits quietly in the background, shaping how you see yourself. You may call it low self-esteem, insecurity, or lack of confidence, but none of these words fully explain what is happening. Because very often, this feeling has nothing to do with your actual abilities or achievements. You can be competent, intelligent, and capable, and still feel smaller than others. Many people live with a constant sense that they are behind their peers, behind their potential, behind some invisible standard they can never quite reach. They look at others and assume that everyone else has something they are missing: confidence, direction, worth. And over time, this quiet comparison becomes the lens through which they experience their entire life. Alfred Adler believed that this feeling is not a personal flaw. It is not proof that something is wrong with you. He believed it is something learned, something deeply human, and something that begins much earlier than most people realize. According to Adler, the problem is not that we feel inferior. The problem is how we try to escape that feeling. Some people respond by constantly seeking approval, others by competing, proving, or dominating. Some give up before they begin, telling themselves that trying is pointless. Different behaviors, same root, a belief that your value depends on how you measure up to others. Adler noticed that people rarely asked the most important question, not how do I become better than others, but why do I need to be better than others in the first place? Because the moment your sense of worth depends on comparison, you lose the ability to live freely. This video is not about becoming more confident or learning how to win at life. It is about understanding where the feeling of inferiority comes from, why it quietly controls so many decisions, and how it shapes the way you see yourself and others. Because once you understand that, comparison begins to lose its power. Alfred Adler had a very different way of looking at human value, and it challenges one of the most deeply ingrained beliefs of modern life.
Alfred Adler was one of the first psychologists to openly challenge the idea that human behavior is primarily driven by instinct, trauma, or pathology. While many of his contemporaries were focused on what was broken in people, Adler was interested in something else. He wanted to understand how people make sense of their place in the world. Adler began his career alongside Freud, but he quickly moved in a different direction. He noticed that many people who came to therapy were not damaged in the way psychology often assumed. They were functioning, intelligent, and capable, yet they were held back by a persistent belief that they were somehow less than others. What Adler saw was that people do not suffer because they are weak. They suffer because they believe they have no value unless they prove it. This belief shapes behavior far more than past events or unconscious drives. According to Adler, the need to feel significant is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Adler believed that every human being begins life in a state of inferiority. As children, we are small, dependent, and unable to survive on our own. This early experience creates a natural sense of being less capable than the adults around us. In itself, this is not a problem. It becomes a problem only when a person never outgrows it. Instead of understanding inferiority as a flaw, Adler saw it as a starting point, a natural condition that motivates growth, learning, and development. The desire to improve, to become capable, and to find one's place in the world grows out of this early sense of limitation. But when this process is disrupted, inferiority turns inward and becomes a lasting self-image. Adler noticed that people who feel chronically inferior often organize their entire lives around compensation. Some try to compensate by seeking constant validation. Others try to dominate or outperform. Some avoid challenges altogether, telling themselves they do not care, when in reality they are afraid to fail. What makes Adler's perspective different is that he did not ask what caused this feeling in the past. He asked what purpose it serves in the present. He believed that human behavior is goal-oriented. We move not only away from pain, but toward imagined outcomes that promise safety or worth. This means that the feeling of inferiority is not just something you have, it is something you are responding to. And the way you respond quietly shapes your choices, your relationships, and the way you see yourself in comparison to others. To understand how deeply this runs, we need to look at one of the most destructive habits modern life encourages: the constant measurement of your worth against other people.
Comparison feels almost unavoidable in modern life. From an early age, people are taught to measure themselves against others. Who is smarter, who is more successful, who is more attractive, who is moving faster. These comparisons are often presented as motivation, as if constantly evaluating yourself against others will push you forward. But Alfred Adler believed the opposite. According to Adler, comparison slowly erodes the sense of individuality. When you measure your worth by external ranking, your internal compass disappears. Instead of asking what feels meaningful or right for you, you begin to ask where you stand in relation to others. Life turns into a silent competition, even when no one explicitly says it is. Adler noticed that people who constantly compare themselves rarely feel satisfied, even when they succeed. There is always someone ahead, someone doing better, someone setting a new standard. This creates a moving target that can never be reached. No matter how much progress you make, the feeling of being behind remains. This is why comparison often leads to paralysis rather than growth. When your value depends on outperforming others, every challenge becomes a threat. Failure is no longer just an experience, it becomes a verdict on your worth. And when the risk of feeling inferior feels too great, many people unconsciously choose to withdraw. Adler believed that comparison shifts the focus from contribution to competition. Instead of asking how you can be useful, creative, or engaged, the question becomes how you can appear superior. This change may seem subtle, but it has profound psychological consequences. A person who lives by comparison is never truly present in their own life. Modern technology amplifies this pattern. Social media presents a constant stream of curated lives, achievements, and milestones. People compare their private struggles to other people's public highlights. Adler did not live in the age of social media, but he understood the psychological mechanism perfectly. The more you compare, the smaller you feel. According to Adler, comparison does not create confidence, it creates dependency. Your sense of worth becomes tied to external validation and relative position. When that happens, you're no longer free to choose your path. You are reacting, adjusting, and measuring rather than living. This is why so many people feel lost even when they're busy and productive. They're moving, but not towards something that belongs to them. They're following standards they did not choose. And over time, this constant orientation towards others weakens the sense of self. To Adler, the question was never how to stop feeling inferior entirely. The question was how to stop letting inferiority dictate your direction. And to answer that, he looked closely at one of the most common ways people try to escape this feeling: living for approval. For Alfred Adler, the need for approval was one of the most common responses to the feeling of inferiority. When a person doubts their own value, they begin to look for it outside themselves, in other people's reactions, praise, acceptance, and reassurance. Approval becomes a substitute for inner security.
At first, this behavior can look harmless, even socially rewarded. Being agreeable, helpful, and easy to like often brings positive feedback. But over time, living for approval comes with a hidden cost. Your choices stop being guided by what feels right and start being shaped by what will be accepted. Adler believed that when approval becomes a psychological necessity, freedom quietly disappears. You begin to anticipate reactions before making decisions. You edit yourself, soften your opinions, and avoid actions that might lead to disapproval. Not because you believe they are wrong, but because you fear the emotional consequences of being rejected. This is why people who live for approval often feel anxious and indecisive. Every choice carries the question, how will this make me look? Instead of experiencing life directly, they experience it through imagined judgments. Their attention is constantly turned outward, scanning for signs of acceptance or rejection. Adler noticed that approval seeking is closely linked to comparison. When you believe that your value depends on how others see you, you naturally begin to measure yourself against those around you. Someone else's success can feel like a personal threat, not because it diminishes you, but because it shifts the hierarchy you rely on for self-worth. Living for approval also creates a fragile sense of identity. When praise is present, you feel stable. When it disappears, you feel lost. Your emotional state becomes dependent on factors you cannot control. According to Adler, this dependency keeps people stuck in patterns they no longer want, but feel unable to leave. What makes this pattern difficult to break is that it often feels like morality. People tell themselves they are being kind, responsible, or selfless, but Adler made a careful distinction. True social connection comes from contribution and mutual respect, not from self-erasure. Approval seeking is not about connection, it is about safety. Adler believed that the fear behind approval seeking is not the fear of disliking, but the fear of being insignificant. When you are unsure of your own worth, rejection feels unbearable. And so, many people quietly shape their lives around avoiding it, even if it means abandoning their own direction. Over time, this leads to a subtle form of resentment, a sense that life is being lived for others, that your energy is constantly spent maintaining acceptance rather than creating something meaningful. And this resentment often turns inward, reinforcing the very feeling of inferiority that started the cycle. To Adler, this was not a personal weakness, it was a learned strategy. And like any strategy, it could be unlearned. But before that can happen, there is another response to inferiority that needs to be understood, one that looks like confidence on the surface, but is driven by the same fear underneath. Alfred Adler noticed that not everyone responds to inferiority by shrinking themselves or seeking approval. Some people move in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to be liked, they try to be above. Instead of avoiding comparison, they attempt to win it. On the surface, this can look like confidence, ambition, or strength, but Adler believed it was often another way of hiding the same underlying fear. This pattern is what Adler described as compensation through superiority. When a person feels deeply insecure, they may attempt to protect themselves by controlling situations, dominating conversations, or positioning themselves as more competent, more important, or more powerful than others. The goal is not connection, but protection. Adler emphasized that genuine confidence does not need to announce itself. It does not need to diminish others to feel stable. False superiority, on the other hand, is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. Any challenge, disagreement, or perceived threat can trigger defensiveness, anger, or contempt.
People who rely on this strategy often feel restless and tense, even when they appear successful. They may push themselves relentlessly, not because they love what they are doing, but because slowing down would expose feelings they are trying to escape. Achievement becomes armor rather than expression. Adler observed that this form of compensation often damages relationships. When worth is tied to being above others, cooperation feels risky and vulnerability feels dangerous. Conversations become competitions. Feedback feels like attack. Over time, this isolates the very person who is trying to protect themselves from feeling small. What makes false superiority difficult to recognize is that society often rewards it. Assertiveness, dominance, and constant achievement are praised, while doubt and reflection are seen as weakness. Adler warned that this cultural reinforcement makes it easy to confuse control with confidence. But beneath the drive to dominate lies the same belief found in approval seeking. The belief that value must be earned by comparison, that worth is conditional, that without proof of superiority, inferiority will take over. Adler believed that as long as a person is trapped between feeling inferior and trying to appear superior, they remain psychologically dependent on others. Their sense of self is still defined by comparison. Whether someone feels above or below, they are still measuring themselves on the same scale. For Adler, the real alternative was not to win the comparison, but to leave it entirely. To shift from a life organized around status and ranking to a life organized around something deeper, something he believed was essential for psychological health and genuine self-worth. That alternative was what Adler called social interest, and in his view, it was the only real way out of the inferiority trap.
Alfred Adler believed that the deepest cause of psychological suffering is isolation. Not physical loneliness, but the feeling of being separate, smaller, or fundamentally disconnected from others. In his view, the inferiority feeling becomes destructive only when a person experiences themselves as standing outside the human community. This is why Adler placed such importance on what he called social interest. By this, he did not mean politeness, self-sacrifice, or living for others' approval. Social interest is the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. It is the sense that your life has value because it contributes, not because it competes. Adler believed that a person begins to feel secure not when they prove their worth, but when they experience themselves as useful and connected. Contribution creates a different kind of value. It does not depend on comparison. It does not require superiority or approval. It is felt internally through participation in life rather than evaluation of it. When social interest is present, the question shifts. Instead of asking, "How do I measure up?" a person begins to ask, "How do I participate?" Instead of worrying about being better or worse, attention moves toward what can be given, created, or shared. This shift fundamentally changes how a person experiences themselves. Adler noticed that people who develop social interest feel less threatened by others' success. Someone else's achievement no longer diminishes them because their worth is not built on relative position. This creates psychological freedom. A person can move at their own pace, follow their own direction, and remain grounded even when others move faster. Social interest also changes the way mistakes are experienced. Failure no longer feels like a collapse of identity. It becomes part of learning and participation. Adler believed that when a person feels connected, they are more willing to take risks because their sense of worth is not constantly at stake. Importantly, Adler did not see social interest as something imposed from the outside.
It is not a moral rule or a social obligation. It is a psychological orientation, a way of relating to life that recognizes interdependence rather than hierarchy. According to Adler, many modern problems arise because people are encouraged to see life as a competition rather than a collaboration. When this happens, inferiority and superiority become two sides of the same struggle. Social interest offers a way out, not by denying individuality, but by placing it within a wider context of meaning. For Adler, a healthy individual is not someone who stands above others, but someone who stands with them, not merged or dependent, but connected. And it is within this connection that the feeling of inferiority begins to loosen its grip. But understanding this idea intellectually is not enough. Adler believed that change begins when a person starts to notice how deeply comparison has shaped their everyday thinking. And this awareness often begins with asking a different kind of question. Adler believed that real psychological change does not come from forcing new behavior, but from seeing your current behavior clearly. The purpose of reflection is not to judge yourself, but to understand the direction your life has quietly taken. And for that, he encouraged people to ask questions that reveal intention rather than guilt. One of the first questions is simple but often avoided. In which moments do you feel smaller than others? Not just openly inferior, but subtly less entitled to speak, choose, or take up space. These moments often pass quickly, but they reveal how deeply comparison has shaped your self-image. Another important question is where you seek reassurance instead of direction. When making decisions, do you listen for inner clarity or for signs of approval? Do you feel relieved when others agree with you, even if the choice does not feel right inside? Adler believed this was one of the clearest signs that value has been outsourced. Adler also encouraged people to observe their reactions to others' success, not to condemn jealousy or irritation, but to notice them. When someone else achieves something you want, do you feel inspired or diminished? These reactions reveal whether your sense of worth is based on contribution or competition. A deeper question follows. What would you do if you were not trying to prove anything? If your actions were not meant to compensate for feeling less, impress others, or protect yourself from judgment? This question can feel unsettling because it removes the familiar motivations that have guided behavior for years. Adler believed it was also important to notice where you avoid participation. Situations where you withdraw, remain passive, or tell yourself you do not care. Often, this avoidance is not indifference, but a strategy to protect yourself from feeling inferior. Seeing this clearly begins to loosen its control. Finally, Adler encouraged people to ask how they relate to the idea of contribution. Not contribution as sacrifice, but as presence. Where do you feel genuinely involved in life? Where do you feel that what you do matters, not because it is praised, but because it is connected to others in a real way? These questions are not meant to be answered quickly. Adler believed they work slowly, reshaping how a person understands their place in the world. As this understanding deepens, comparison loses urgency, approval becomes less necessary, and the feeling of inferiority begins to soften, not because it is fought, but because it is no longer needed. When a person starts to live from this place, their sense of value becomes quieter but stronger, less dependent but more stable, and this creates the conditions for a different relationship with life itself.
Alfred Adler did not believe that the feeling of inferiority is something that needs to be eliminated. He believed it needs to be understood. In its natural form, it is not a weakness, but a signal, a reminder that human beings are shaped through relationship, effort, and belonging.
According to Adler, the problem begins when a person builds their entire sense of value around comparison. When worth depends on being above or below others, life becomes a constant evaluation. And in that state, peace is impossible. There will always be someone ahead, someone behind, and something to prove. Adler offered a different foundation for self-worth, one that does not require superiority, approval, or constant reassurance. He believed that value emerges naturally when a person experiences themselves as connected and contributing, not perfect, not exceptional, but involved. When you stop measuring yourself against others, something important changes. You begin to move at your own pace. Decisions feel less urgent, less defensive. Mistakes lose their power to define you. Life becomes less about protecting your image and more about participating honestly. Adler believed that freedom begins when a person no longer needs to escape the feeling of being less. When inferiority is no longer treated as an enemy, it loses its grip. It no longer dictates behavior, motivation, or direction. It becomes simply one part of the human experience. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means it becomes more grounded, less reactive, more coherent. The constant pressure to prove your worth slowly fades, replaced by a quieter sense of belonging. If you recognize yourself in these ideas, you're not alone. Many people live with a silent sense of inferiority without realizing how much it shapes their choices. Adler believed that awareness is the beginning of change, not dramatic transformation, but a gradual return to yourself. The moment you stop asking how you compare to others, you begin to ask a more meaningful question. How do I want to participate in life? And according to Adler, it is in answering that question that a person finally begins to feel at home in their own existence.